Now on BBC Two, today's big political stories. Joined by plenty of guests, Joe Coburn brings us Politics Live.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative Vice Chair Helen Grant and former Labour Cabinet Minister Charlie Faulkner, former head of the Commission for Racial Equality Trevor Phillips and the journalist Ella Whelan. Today...
So is it an empty threat to vote against the budget?
Is this party leader prepared to bring down the government? Does this former leader want to derail universal credit?
You will run into the sort of problems that the Conservative Party ran into with the poll tax.
And how do we solve the problem with renting?
It's just been incredibly stressful. I mean, not knowing where you're going to live at the end of the day, I just wouldn't wish it upon anybody.
Let's start by looking at the front page of this morning's Times. It says employers must reveal ethnic pay gap of staff. Does anyone disagree with that?
No.
Yes.
No.
Why?
In a way, because I think that the problem with these is, as well as the gender pay gap, which I've got into a lot of trouble by saying is largely a myth, is that it's the kind of tokenistic measures like this that tend to just fuel a very simplistic and unhelpful view of the issue of race or gender in relation to work we had last year, the race disparity audit, which many people criticised as putting forward this very simplistic, overly negative view of the situation of race in the UK. I think something like this, in the same way that it's completely made the discussion about women's place in work a sort of ridiculous battle that's unhelpful, I think this could do the same.
Why is that? Because if an individual employer is revealed to have a particularly high gap, for example, in relation to gender, and you can see that in law firms, the ones with the really bad gender gaps are now doing things about it, it's really making a difference. Why are you saying it's tokenism? That seems rubbish to me.
Oh, well, so we used to, when there was discrepancies or discrimination in relation to either race or gender, that we used to, workers would do stuff about that, workers would go on strike.
But how would they know?
Exactly.
The basis that you would have people talking and saying we would have...
instead of having these things.
I think that would be a better way of dealing with. I'm very sceptical of this idea that you sort of make friendly capitalism and friendly bosses in a way that actually, if there is a discrepancy in relation to race or gender, or people are being discriminated against, feel that they need to take action, then they should take action. But this, I can't see this as being anything other than tokenistic.
But they need to be aware of the fact that they are being discriminated. I mean, just taking a step back, the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street and said, look, I want to build a country that works for everyone. A little while later, she commissioned this race disparity audit. It pinpoints disparities in public services ethnically, and it's a useful tool.
How does it actually guarantee action is taken?
Well, this is action. This is a really good example
Just
of
publishing
action.
the data?
Well, the light of transparency is a very, very powerful thing, and if people have to publish data, then usually people like you and me and Charlie and others ask questions, and that's the start of the process.
Is it the right strategy, Trevor?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when the gender pay gaps were published earlier on this year, frankly, there was more action in more companies than there had been in the last 20 to 25 years, because if people know their story is going to be told, they want it to be a good one. So actually, that's made everything different. And I think, I kind of understand where Ella's coming from, but I think you're tilting at a windmill. Actually, if the data on ethnic pay differentials is released, we'll get a better picture of why some groups are chronically underachieving in the employment sphere and why some are overachieving. And that will tell us how to help get rid of some of the barriers, which aren't just about people being terribly racist. They are to do with geography, they might be to do with educational success and so on. So this will give us a more detailed and sophisticated picture so we can actually do something about it rather than shout at each other.
I think the problem is as well
Hang on, one at a time.
we are doing this because out of the audit, it's been revealed that there is a gap. I mean, if there wasn't a gap, it wouldn't be happening. But there is a BAME employment gap and, in terms of pay and positioning. And, of course, we do need to do something.
Yeah, but this reporting will be a slightly different thing because, for example, what we don't know at the moment, though actually we sort of know it, is that some groups, South Asians, for example, outperform the average by quite a distance, whereas Pakistani Muslims underperform. Now, what this reporting regime, if it comes in, and by the way, the government hasn't said it will come in. They're asking...
It's a consultation.
It's a consultation, so let's not imagine this has happened. What this will help us understand is why that's true
but
and what we can do about it.
Trevor, what is the harm in it?
I'm not complaining about it. I'm saying it's a good thing.
Let's hear what
The harm comes in with the solution of, you know, having the data, I think, is something that I don't think anyone can be against necessarily, so fine, I give you that. But the thing is, what happens is that when the solutions that get talked about this often come back to things like affirmative action quotas, certainly in relation to the gender pay gap, there's been a lot of talk about this, about hiring more women, getting more women in roles of representation.
But no one's
and
mentioned
quotas.
No one's mentioned quotas.
I mean, the
could
way
that
in
be the
which
result?
this is
Could that be the result of what's
It
needed
will
in order
most
to
likely
improve
be
it?
No one's mentioned quotas. It depends what comes out of the consultation.
But you're bound to identify a gap, as happened in relation to gender. What then happens is people compare themselves with their peers.
Correct.
The law firms compare with each other. The NHS compares
Do you not
with the
think workers talk together? Do you not think that workers
They have
are
no
talking
idea
together?
how... the extraordinary thing about the law firms, for example, was some of them had a pay gap of 30 or 40% in relation to women, some had 10%.
And people were
and they
surprised.
don't know the figures.
I don't think you've been on... I think it's unlikely that you've been on many factory
And
floors
just
of late.
as a matter of fact,
Fine.
until very recently, it was unlawful to reveal your pay to the person who's sitting next to you. So transparency started to change that. I mean, I sort of understand that you don't want to get into this sort of mad piece of identity politics, but I think you're aiming at just a wrong target. This is a good thing to do. It will open up the possibility for all sorts of people. Leave this alone. Let us get on with it.
All right, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk about Brexit because we haven't talked about it for about 5 minutes. No, we're going to talk about Brexit and some of the developments that have happened overnight. They're happening all the time. Let's welcome Christopher Montgomery. He's a Conservative who used to be Chief of Staff for the DUP at Westminster till last year and a former director of Vote Leave. Just before we talk to you, let's have a look at this article in the Daily Telegraph. It's by Sammy Wilson, who is their Brexit spokesman. It says the DUP won't be bribed, bullied or browbeaten. You're laughing, Charlie.
They won't be bribed. So they're laughing at that. I think we're bribed with £1 billion.
Who would you take the money from?
The government.
No, the money's being spent. Which disadvantaged child road project? Who would you take the money from?
Who would you take the money from?
You said it's a bribe. People would say it was spent on socially useful projects.
Was, but
so who would you take the money from?
They got the money from...
You don't think they should have done?
It was borrowed. I was saying...
You don't think the schools should have got the money?
No, I think our schools...
Labour politics is very confusing these days.
Not as confusing as DUP politics,
No,
but
they're pretty simple and straightforward.
I like the way you're debating the headline, even for Sammy Wilson article. Let's talk about what was behind it. Chris, first of all, what's happened? What's the issue here for the DUP?
The issue for the BBC...
Not for the BBC.
The issue for the DUP, much like the issue for the Tory right, is that the Prime Minister has negotiating in Brussels a civil servant who doesn't get Westminster politics. So this is exactly the same mistake that Robbins made a year ago. He just doesn't get the nuance of SW1 politics.
And what is it he doesn't get?
Which is that the unionists aren't going to vote for non-unionist things. This, again, it's a very, very simple issue. People are saying, oh, why can't they just suck up more checks? Why can't they just agree that the EU is going to do things inside the UK? And that's fine, and it'll wash to them, and they won't mind at all. Because they're unionists.
Right, well, Helen, do you not, and does the government not understand the DUP on whom they are extremely reliant because they are, to some extent, vital in votes like the budget?
Yeah, I mean, of course we understand the DUP. We have a good relationship with them, confidence and supply. But, you know, I think we've just got to remember that a lot of people are threatening a lot of different things at the moment, every day.
Do you believe the threat that the DUP have said that they will vote down the budget unless they have a cast-iron guarantee in terms of the Brexit?
What's happening is that we're at a critical point in the negotiations. People are posturing, people are playing hardball. Why shouldn't they? Everybody else is. But at the end of the day, We do want a deal. The budget is in the interests of all of our constituents and theirs, and I would like to think they would vote on it.
Right, but everyone wants a deal. They don't want the same deal. That's the problem, isn't it, Helen?
Well,
Do you
that's
understand
a
what the
negotiation.
DUP want? You mentioned confidence and supply. They are needed by the government to supply confidence on key votes like the budget. And if they don't, the government could fall. So do you believe their threat to withhold or vote against the budget?
No, I don't. I think they're bluffing.
And they're bluffing because you're rolling your eyes.
Why would they bluff on this?
Well,
It doesn't make any sense.
well, hang on. You've left that over. So first of all, you don't think they're bluffing.
They can't bluff on this. They are unionists. I'm sorry if I'm sounding desperately repetitive. If you say to unionists, we're going to do things against the union, they're going to say,
What are you holding out for? Tell us what you're holding out for.
I'm a member of the DUP, I'm not holding out for anything.
What are they holding
Well,
out
hang
for?
on, answer Helen's question.
Union.
What are they holding out for?
They're not doing
Charlie, let me just get Helen, because Helen said, what are they holding out for?
I don't know.
What is it they're holding out for?
Brexit.
Isn't this fantastic?
Why not wait and see
I mean,
what the
what's
Prime
being-
Minister is able
what's
to bring
being-
back?
Who knows what they're holding out for?
And could it result in havoc that the DUP would be the big losers in too if it was no
So,
deal?
again-
Especially if they got Jeremy Corbyn.
So is that your threat on them?
The DUP is holding out for Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. Give me a break.
Are they saying, just
Honestly.
are they saying
This is
they
the
want an
stupidest
open
bluff I've
border
ever seen
and
in my
no
life.
checks between the mainland
Well, let
and
Chris
Northern Ireland?
answer.
Do you want to talk about the stupid
Yes,
bluff?
yes,
first?
stupid
Maybe
bluffing, and then we'll
checks
do
first,
that.
We'll talk about the stupid
And I'll
bluff
let
first.
Helen.
If they caused a general election, which it probably would come after a budget failing, because although the Fixed Term Parliament Act no longer makes budgets a confidence matter, we have a parliamentary system, you need to get money through. If the government can't spend money, there will be an election in due course. This idea that they're scared of an election, they would,
No, they're not scared of an
they
election.
would have a fantastic success in Northern Ireland. And then this Corbyn fellow that you keep talking about, he's not fantastically successful in the polls. They're odds on for another hung parliament anyway. The idea that Corbyn's going to become Prime Minister...
All right.
To risk having the politician of their nightmare as Prime Minister.
All right, well,
So
Chris
the
is saying no.
The choice in front of them is, we're definitely going to do something anti-unionist, or maybe you'll get Corbyn. That's not a complicated choice. I'm surprised you're finding it a complicated choice.
I don't think it's a complicated choice at all.
As someone
I don't
from a-
believe that they are going to risk that.
As someone from an Irish nationalist background, it kind of bores me to show any support for the DUP, but I think if we dial back and say what this issue is about the Irish border is actually quite an important one, and say what you like about the DUP, I have a lot to say about them. They're fairly right when it comes to Brexit because they're quite serious about it, and I think the way that the Irish border has been used as this political football in relation to Brexit negotiations, I mean, Helen, you said everything's up for negotiation. From my point of view, nothing should be up for negotiation when it comes to Brexit. You should deliver as a government what you promised to do and what the people voted
but
for.
you have to
Never mind this
negotiate.
game fighting. Never mind. One of the
20
details, and let me just finish. One of the details about the Irish border, we had, I think it was last week or the week before, Michel Barnier coming out and saying we need to de-dramatise the Irish border. This is, I mean, the EU has been the one that has dramatised the Irish border.
Right,
for the last 2 years.
I'm going to stop you all talking over each other. I'm going to let Helen speak.
Thank you. We are a unionist party. The Prime Minister has already said we will not break that up. But to pick up on your point about negotiation, you know, there are 27 other countries that we have to deal with. Not everybody is going to say yes immediately to all of our proposals. But the proposal that the Prime Minister is putting, well, we are honouring that in the proposal that the Prime Minister... Yeah, we are. We are honouring the referendum, which is what we must do, and it's the only other deal on the table.
All right, Helen, would
There's
you be
nothing else.
prepared to see more regulatory checks on that border between Northern Ireland and the UK, so down the Irish Sea?
Well, I wouldn't, and I
So
think that
no more at all,
and
no
I
relaxing
think
in any
that
way?
is a negotiating point. How light touch can we be?
So what are you worried about?
I'm worried about the fact that Helen Grant has just said that they're bluffing. I think the level of
The
DUP MPs.
I'm a Tory, but just the level of complacency there terrifies me.
but
it's such a grotesque misreading of
You
where they are.
don't think they are bluffing?
They can't bluff.
Well, of course they can bluff.
Except...
No, they can't bluff on this.
All right, well, on the issue of bluff, just before we go to Henry Mance, who's been at Lobby, so he will have heard what Number 10 has said in response to the threats from the DUP. One of the issues, Trevor Phillips mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, and they wouldn't want to risk that. And you've said, well, no, they would be prepared.
I'm going to pick up on that. They have risked graver things than Jeremy Corbyn in the past.
The other thing is, what about their unique?
About Jeremy Corbyn.
But hang on, what about their unique
terrorism? I'm sorry, I've got to skip.
What about their unique position, their powerful position they hold right now in terms of supply? Are they prepared to risk that?
Sorry, you're making out as if it's a good choice or a bad choice. It's a choice between two different bad things. And imposing an intra-UK border would be the worst thing.
All right, let's talk to Henry Mance. He's been waiting patiently. Henry, tell us again, briefly, what the DUP are threatening. Are they still sticking to those threats of voting against the budget if they don't get clarity on the border issue?
They are very much so. And in fact, Sammy Wilson, one of the hardline DUP MPs, was out today talking up the possibility of a general election, which is the last thing the government wants. So he was saying the DUP has never been afraid of elections and we're not afraid of one now. We don't want one, he was saying. But I think this is really strong language. And what is very difficult for Downing Street to gauge, and indeed for everyone in Westminster to gauge, is this a bluff? And is this for a domestic audience in Northern Ireland to show that the DUP is trying to get the best deal it possibly can? Or is it in fact an alliance with the hardline Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party that could bring the House down?
It's very, I mean, it's interesting to hear what Christopher is saying, very interesting to hear what Christopher is saying, because it seems to me there are two possibilities out of a general election. Another hung parliament, in which case the DUP solve nothing. Alternatively, it seems more likely to me if government breaks down, i.e. the government just cannot deliver, then Labour will win. So it appears on the basis of what Christopher is saying the DUP are thinking, that they either get straight back to the position they've started or a Labour government, which I think probably, though I don't know, Christopher appears to be the expert on this, that's not something they want. So
all right,
it's very difficult to see what they want.
Before Chris answers, let's just hear what Number 10, how they responded to all of this, Henry. Henry, can you hear me?
Sorry, I missed that.
No, that's all right. How's Number 10 responded?
Number 10 says, look, this is a party political alliance between the Conservative Party and DUP. The Conservative Party, Conservative officials at the moment are keeping very stum. They do have something in their back pocket, which is that this deal, which was signed after the general election, was for £1 billion. 410 million of that has been put into the Northern Ireland budget, but there's a lot still left behind.
To get to the budget.
The DUP would be leaving that on the table if they walked away now.
All right, Henry, thank you very much for joining us there. Chris, to respond to that, I mean, if that money was withdrawn, that would also be a massive blow to the DUP.
Just 2 points. One, for the benefit of your viewers at home, when you used to use television cameras and a satellite feed, it was much better. Stop doing this ridiculous thing with mobile phones.
Never mind about that.
The second point is, at lobby yesterday, yes, some tool in Number 10 said, some idiot in Number 10 said, we might...
The language.
We might... Absolute fool in Number 10 said, we might withdraw this money. What are they've spent this money. What are they going to do? Are they going to say to children who've got better teaching?
They haven't spent it all. They've allocated
it. They're going to take the money back. That's the phrase they used. What are they going to say? Forget the things you've learned.
All right. Well, on that, Helen, are you prepared to take that money back?
What I think should happen is people should hold their nerve, which is what Dominic said in the week. Let the Prime Minister do the job that she was selected and elected to do, and let her do the deal. And then we can see where we are. And that's my frustration, that Arlene Foster has made this, threat or whatever as to what's going to happen with the budget, which is in their constituents' interests too. Now, why not just let the Prime Minister do what she's trying to do? A lot of good work is happening. None of us are around the negotiating table.
Because they don't trust her?
We're not doing the deal, but just let her bring back the deal and see where we are.
Before we move on, I'd like to just show you this tweet from the Conservative MP Mark Pritchard, because we have been talking around the subject that if the DUP were to vote down the budget, it could result in bringing down the government and it could lead to a general election or maybe a leadership challenge. He says lots of wild and loose talk about leadership moves. There's no vacancy. However, on a technical point, if a vacancy did arise, process need not take more than 2 working weeks, 4 days in Commons if needed and 6 days with membership. Does not need to be an overly long process. Is that helpful, Helen?
I've made my position quite clear, Joe. I just think, everybody can be pretty hypothetical, but the Prime Minister has to deal with realities. She's working very hard to get this deal. I mean, I like deals. I like negotiating, but I wouldn't want to be doing what she has to do.
Things get negotiated away,
and I just don't see why we can't just get behind our Prime Minister and let her do what she's supposed to be doing.
The deal she's proposing is terrible.
What
because
is the deal she's proposing?
It has both upset Leavers and those Remainers who want to overturn
It's a deal. It's a deal, Charlie, that honours the referendum.
All right, can I just ask Charlie, before we move on, how many Labour MPs do you think will vote for a broad Chequers plan? Chequers being the government's stance
I don't think very many. I think you're going to end up with a situation where she can't get it through with the DUP and the Conservatives, she's not going to get it through. But I don't know at the moment if the DUP is saying no border in Ireland and no checks. And when she says, how am I going to do that, to Arlene Foster, Arlene is saying, that's your problem.
All right, the one final question before I move on. Is it about checks, or is it about who governs Northern Ireland and its economy?
It's ultimately a constitutional issue.
What is the issue?
OK, Chris, thank you very much. In a minute, we'll speak to Hilary Burkitt from the housing charity Shelter. Lots to talk about when it comes to the problems faced by people who rent. But first, let's take a look at this.
I'm Lauren Dowes and I'm 47. I run a small self-employed business. I teach creative movement to senior women, so it's an over 50s class. We moved here 14 and a half years ago. So I moved here with my daughter, she was 3. This little cottage on a farm. Her dad and I were together at that time, and through whatever reason we separated, so I ended up really here on my own with my daughter, and she's now 17, so it's been a long time. It was really inexpensive, it was affordable, it was safe, there was a little primary school up the road, and it kind of ticked all the boxes in terms of a place for me to be safe with my daughter. It was okay for a number of years, and then the last 3 years the rents shot up. I had to claim housing benefit at that point because my daughter had some health problems when she was 14, which meant she had to be put on a part-time table at school for sometimes an hour or 2 hours a day. And I just had to cut back on all my work and go on to full housing benefit. The first time it went up £80 a month, and that was quite alarming, but it was okay because it was still within the housing benefit kind of cap. And the second time then it exceeded the housing benefit cap. It went up about another £80 or £90 a month. And then it far exceeded, it was like £125 over the housing benefit cap, and then it became really scary. My landlord was actually really, really considerate and understanding, and I was in a constant negotiation with him about how to make this work. For him, obviously, it's a business. It's just been incredibly stressful. I mean, not knowing where you're going to live, I just wouldn't wish it upon anybody. The benefits can't keep up with the demands of the market rents. There were some days where I just didn't know what I was going to do. I did get a lot of help. I was on the phone all the time asking, different charities and that was my that became a kind of a job. I've always wanted to maintain the fact that I've worked, even if it might be 16 hours a week when my daughter's been ill, so that I could, always have a vision that at some point when my daughter's well and when she leaves home, that I am going to be able to get myself into a good position. We've finally been offered a council house after bidding and doing the whole process relentlessly and religiously every single 2 weeks, and we've been offered this great little place which is perfect, and I can see that we're going to be safe. They're never going to put the rent up excessively in one blow. They're not going to take it away. We're going to be okay now.
Hilary, how representative is that particular story to other renters out there?
Well, we've got 11 million people now renting in the private rented sector in this country, and unfortunately many of them are facing the kind of challenges that we just heard from Lauren. We know now that losing a tenancy in the private rented sector is the leading cause of people becoming homeless in this country, and it's the kind of sharp end that we see at Shelter all the time. But it's not just limited to that sharp end. We know that private rents have soared whilst wages haven't. Private rents have got up 60% faster than wages in the last 5 years. So it's a problem that's affecting a lot of people. It's the lack of affordability. It's the fact housing benefit has been frozen and is not keeping up with those soaring rents. And it's the fact that people don't have the stability at the moment, that they can be chucked out by their landlord at a moment's notice. Well, so those things in combination is really creating an absolute crisis in the private rented sector, and renters are fed up.
Right. I mean, let's take the first sort of points. The gap between what is being expected from people to pay in terms of rent and the fact that wages have stagnated. Yes, they're climbing now a little bit more, but they have stagnated over a period of 10 years. How do you account for that gap? How can you expect people to find the money?
In terms of paying
Renting,
their
yes.
rent? Well, there's a piece of legislation going through at the moment, past third reading, and it makes a number of reforms that I think will ease the pressure on tenants, on renters. For example, capping deposits, stopping letting fees, banning letting fees, and preparing lists of, you know, unscrupulous landlords. There's also a consultation happening as well on whether there should be a longer lease, a longer tenancy, which would give even more security. I know a lot of renters feel extremely vulnerable. There's very little security. We've all rented at one time or another.
But this has been going on now for 8 years under Conservative and coalition governments.
Well, and before that as well.
Sure, I'll come on to that.
So I think there's specific things that we need to do to help people that are struggling. But in addition to that, Joe, as well, it's a matter of making sure the economy is doing well, and that we're doing everything we can to build more homes and provide more houses, so that, you know, we're increasing the supply for people, because we know the demand is there.
Is that going to be enough when you're talking about a situation of crisis now?
The consultation on longer tenancies is really welcome, and legislating to ensure that people have got that greater amount of security in private renting would be, it wouldn't solve everything, but it would be a big step in the right direction. So that would absolutely help. But as you were saying, building more homes, and particularly we really need more social homes. People need a decent alternative to the private renting. People know that home ownership is just way out of reach at the moment.
Can I just say on the homes point as well? I mean, unfortunately, I said we should be nice before we went in, but, you know, under Labour, they pretty much stopped building. And so when we came in 2010, we had to get Britain building again. We're building 300,000 homes per annum. The Prime Minister has just removed a cap as well on how much councils can to borrow to build.
All right, but
so there will be even more council houses, which will hopefully help people.
Right, I mean, chickens are coming home to roost, aren't they?
Well, first of all, we didn't build enough under Labour. We built so much more than the Tories have built. Secondly, Hillary is absolutely right. You do need to give security of tenure, and the government has produced a consultation paper saying maybe we'll produce security of tenure legally, but they're not committed themselves to it. They're not dealing with what Lauren was identifying there as the problem. You can just wham up the rent and get rid of somebody that way, whatever the security of tenure. And you need as well to put in place some controls over the extent to which people can put the rent up. Maybe CPI once a year is all that should be allowed, because if you don't do that, you don't give people security. And what's happening is that the way that people are living is changing. In the last 10 years, the number of families who are now dependent on the private rent sector has gone up dramatically. And you need to change the security of tenure, change the amount of rent control, and give people much more of a sense that they are secure with their family than they have at the moment.
Is there a political price to pay when young people feel they don't have a stake in society if they can't afford to rent somewhere decent or own their own home?
Certainly, but I think it would be wrong to see this as a generational issue. There are plenty of working class families, working class people from the 60s who weren't part of that baby boomer kind of narrative that gets put out now. This is not something that can be defined by young versus old. And I can also feel the nation kind of rolling their eyes at the continuous and non-stop debate between Labour and Tories. We built more houses, no, we built more houses, no, we will. And the houses are yet to materialise. I mean, you have to get serious about it. It's no good saying we need to build more homes. You need to build hundreds of thousands for as many that is necessary. You are not. Over the last few years, it has not materialised. The housing crisis. Why do we have a housing crisis then? I mean, how can you answer the fact that we have a housing crisis? You have terrible stories like that.
Because
you have young people not being able to rent or not buy or even rent.
All right, and we're going to get Trevor.
I'm slightly offended you looked straight past me when you asked a question about young people. But anyway, I agree with what...
You're young in your mind, I'm sure.
I agree with what Charlie said, but at the end of the day, this is really all about getting more homes built.
It is.
And some of it is money, and what the Prime Minister has done this week is good, but ultimately, we've got to attack the planning system, because that's actually the stranglehold here. You can't build on most of the places that should be available. And that actually is what's holding back supply. And some governments have got to have the courage to say, look, guys, I know you don't want it in your backyard, but we're going to put the houses there.
Would that unlock it?
I would say the real issue is not so much planning but land, and it's the cost of land that we've got to address. If we can take some bold steps to look at the cost of land, that would really help with actually getting more homes built.
Is there also a philosophical question behind too much focus on the dream of owning your own home? Has it been successive governments' fault for concentrating their efforts there with intervention schemes like Help to Buy, rather than focusing attention on the private rental market and doing something about it?
I think people should have the option of both. If you want to rent, rent. If you want to buy, buy. You can't just say one or the other.
Well, what happened is that it got out of kilter. They said you should own your own home, and then, as Hilary is saying, it became too expensive to own your own home. Then large numbers of families have been forced back onto the private rented sector, and there's no security of tenure. So the way that the law works has now got out of kilter with the way that people are living.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and to tell the truth, we are out of step with pretty much everywhere else in Europe when it comes to being the balance between home ownership and rental, and perhaps we need to lean back to favour rental a bit more.
What's wrong with buying your own home?
No one says anything wrong with it, but
I'm just saying, forced to rent, you've got to protect.
We're just way out of line in terms of the balance between ownership and rental. And for many people, rental is probably a better option. At the moment, that's not possible. I mean, in the United States, where I spend a lot of time, rental is just as good an option as owning your own home. And people who have money rent, but put their capital somewhere else into helping businesses grow, for example. So I just think we need to think a bit more creatively about this.
Hilary, thank you very much. Let's talk about universal credit, because the former Prime Minister, John Major, intervened on what has become a tricky subject for the government. Let's have a listen.
The theory of universal credit is impeccable, and it is entirely logical. But in order to introduce something like universal credit, you need to look at those people who in the short term are going to lose and protect them, or you will run into the sort of problems that the Conservative Party ran into with the poll tax in the late 1980s.
John Major talking to Nick Robinson there. Helen, is he right? Is this at risk of becoming poll tax Mark II?
No. Universal credit needed to be reformed, and I thought this might come up, and I was thinking on the way in, it can't possibly be right for you to work 16 hours, receive a certain sum of money, and then work 17 hours and get less. And that's the nub of it. And we needed to reform it. It rolls 6 benefits into one. It's being rolled out very, very slowly and very carefully. We've put over £3 billion into making sure, in this transitional arrangement, to make sure people that move from one benefit to the new benefit are not financially worse off.
But they are. I mean, Helen, the evidence shows that there are some families who are, and now we know, I mean, it's been reported and backed up, that there will be families who could lose £200 or £2,400 a year. Would you be happy for your constituents to be in that situation?
No, of course I wouldn't, but I also wouldn't want my constituents to think it doesn't pay me to work. I think that's a terrible position to be in. Now, Labour have obviously said we would scrap it, but they haven't put forward any alternative proposal, and therefore I assume they would just leave people languishing in benefits when not necessarily they don't necessarily want to be on benefits.
Should more money be put in to make that transition easier for those families and those situations where people find themselves unable to cover the time frame before they receive the next benefit?
Well, an awful lot is happening.
Should more be done?
An advance has been doubled. The repayment time for that advance has also been doubled. We've formed a partnership with the CAB as well to help people make the transition and also to help them budget. But in addition to all that, Joe, it's not just a matter of moving people from one benefit to the other and trying to manage the transition. It's about making sure that hard-working families can manage, and that's why we've done a number of other things, like freezing fuel duty, doubling free childcare, increasing the national living wage, increasing personal allowances, cracking down on payday lenders.
Right, so but you haven't answered my question about should more be done. Should more money be put in? Ian Duncan-Smith, who knows something about this, obviously, because he was responsible for it, has said that actually the manifesto pledge to raise the tax threshold, which costs a lot of money, should be put on hold, and that money should be put in to universal credit when it is rolled out across the country in the new year. Do you agree?
Well, it's being rolled out very slowly, very carefully.
But that's not my question.
We
Do
are
you agree
talking
that
to
that should be done with different money?
You'd have to get Estimate Vey in here to
Well, what do you think?
answer that. Well,
You're vice chair of the party.
Yeah, but I'm not the Work and Pensions Secretary, and all I know is that £3 billion has gone into making sure no one loses out financially in changing from one benefit to the other.
All right, just finally, should the rollout be paused while these things are discussed, debated and sorted out?
Well, it's happening very, very slowly.
So no.
Yeah, I think we should just keep going with it, listening to what people say, and you know, making any changes that we need to make.
Helen is right, Charlie, that Labour was very much squarely behind the principle of universal credit. Like many Tory MPs, very much against, in some areas, how it has been executed. John McDonnell says it should be scrapped. Is he right?
He is right, yes.
Why?
There are two problems with it. One, it's not working as an administrative thing, and the whole thing is a disaster when it rolls out. Secondly,
Well, is it a disaster? I mean, you say the whole thing is a disaster. We've heard from Helen that actually it is successful in many areas.
Well, it depends what you would regard as a disaster, Joe. If you would regard, say, 10 or 15% of the number of people getting the wrong benefit, is that a disaster because... And you're justifying, I think, by the fact that 85% are getting the right benefit. No, I would regard that as a disaster.
OK.
And the second point is they're using it as an excuse to take between 2 and 3 billion out of what people would otherwise get.
Right. Sanctions and making conditions, of course, for receiving welfare benefits started under Labour.
They did.
Right. So you do
That's not
support...
universal.
No, but you support the idea of having a system whereby there are checks and balances.
I support the idea of there being checks and balances. I support the idea of welfare not encouraging people not to work. That's why we introduced the whole tax credit system.
Right. There are a lot of case studies where people have been pushed into poverty as a result of universal credit and because of the way it's been rolled out. Should it be paused?
I don't see how you can, actually. And let's remember, you know, before universal credit, there were a series of different kinds of benefit which nobody understood and where people, you know...
So you think it's a good idea in principle?
I've always thought it's a good idea in principle, but I think what this exposes is that... And, I never want to... disagree with Charlie about anything because he's much smarter than I am, but it does demonstrate actually a problem that we have in politics, which is politicians think that they can will something, and once it's been something's gone through Parliament, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, actually, this was a gigantic project, not enough money, not enough time, and it's a basic problem of our government that. The distinction between wanting to do something and actually being able to deliver it is constantly being ignored.
It's you know, if anyone who's been through the benefit system, has had any experience, knows how kind of Kafkaesque it is. And part of the problem with the universal credit, though you can say it was good in principle, built into it is a delay in payment, which has directly resulted in people needing to access food banks. It's not something that you can tinker with. Yeah, it's not something you can tinker with to make right. It's fundamentally flawed. I mean, you've got a government with absolutely no politics behind us. On the one hand, it's not creating jobs for people. On the other hand, it's punishing. On the other hand, it's failing to create enough jobs. On the other hand, it's punishing and whipping people when they can't get a job. I mean, make your mind up.
But throwing the car into reverse would be even more chaotic. I mean,
what do you do now? You've got a system that's completely crap. You've got to say to the DWP...
Charlie, you've got to run with it, and if that means you've got to put more money into it, you've got to put more money into it.
That is a classic... Throwing it back into money into this disaster, no, that's a disaster.
But what's the alternative,
The alternative is you could stop to start with. You then work out which of the existing benefits...
So while you stop, what is going to happen to people?
The existing benefit system.
Well, Helen, why don't you scrap the delay?
Helen, why don't you...
Helen, why don't you don't talk over each other. Ella, ask the question to Helen.
Helen, why don't you... For example, the delay in payments is something that's been proven to directly affect people extremely negatively. You've now, I think, cut it by a number of days. Why not scrap it entirely if you really think it's wrong that people are going to food banks?
You mean the 7-day waiting period? That's been scrapped. No, it's gone.
Yeah, but there's still a 5-week wait, isn't there, between getting benefits. Can you do anything about that? Should you do anything about that?
Well, again, I think it's the advance, that there are many more advances being given so people don't lose out. And the repayment period for that advance has also been doubled.
Right.
And as I said, £3 billion has gone into making sure people don't.
And we've heard that. We're going to.
A massive cock up there.
We are going to, but you're still supporting it.
Because I don't think you can do anything else.
All right, we're going to move on
Practically.
and talk about something else because Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has been talking about how black history should be taught in schools. Here he is in Bristol.
I think we need to understand the history of empire, the treatment of black people across the empire, and the enormous contribution made by the black community to this country. And the Windrush scandal, in a sense, has highlighted all of this. And Bristol was, of course, a place that was a centre of the slave trade. And Bristol as a city, some people, the merchants, made a great deal of money out of it, as happened in Liverpool. But I think it's important that all our children understand our collective history, and that way we actually make communities stronger.
Trevor, what do you think?
Oh, I'm absolutely delighted, because if that means that people are going to buy Windrush by Mike and Trevor Phillips, available in all good bookstores, I'm really pleased.
Shameless.
I don't think there's anything wrong with this at all. I think it's obviously been nice to black people day to day. So
do you think it is just today, then? You think Jeremy Corbyn is going to do anything more than just headline?
I have no idea, but I think it's good that he has drawn attention to this. I don't have any problem with it, and frankly, it is important for all children, as it might be for black children, to understand all aspects of our history, which includes that period of colonialism and slavery.
Right, well, let's have a look what the Daily Mail said about it. Now Corbyn is trying to indoctrinate our children. Charlie?
Now, I'm strongly in favour, more strongly in favour of this than Trevor, in the sense that, for me, history really matters. It defines what your values are. If you know where you've come from and what's happened to you. So I'm Scottish. We have a very profound sense of what happened to us. And I think for example, the Afro-Caribbean community in the UK, for them to know what happened, Trevor becoming the chair of the Equalities Commission, Stephen Lawrence being murdered, how the Windrush community was treated, those things being woven into our history are important both for the Afro-Caribbean community but for the country as a whole.
Has there not been enough of this in the curriculum for children to learn about the importance of black history and black heritage?
I think you might, reading and listening to the speech from Jeremy Corbyn, might think that this wasn't taught at all and that we were sort of really doing our kids a disservice at the moment. I think that's not true. I agree with Trevor that I think more history, more as it's called knowledge-based education, which is a clunky phrase for saying actually just a better education system that teaches kids more is useful. However, my one little bit of scepticism that holds me back is that I think it would be unfortunate if we used education for political grandstanding. And I think that potentially, especially in relation to issues like this, or whether it be issues around teaching more kids about more women who are forgotten in history, it's not necessarily about the essence of the importance of history itself, more about a kind of political posturing. I think that's very helpful for education.
Helen?
Well, I'm glad he's talking about Black History Month. I think it's an essential entry in our calendar. I agree with many, with pretty much what you said. I don't think it should be used politically. In terms of teaching, there needs to be balance. And I think if one side of the story, a negative aspect, is going to be told, then we need to have an opposite, more positive aspect coming out too. I'm just glad he's celebrating Black History Month. It's a special month. There's fantastic things going on, and the more talk of these things, the contributions made, the good contributions made by black people, the better.
I agree with that. My only reservation would be, let's not always make this a story of terrible oppression and gossip, because there are black people who, in spite of all the things that were done to us, who shone, who were brilliant, who were courageous, and we need to hear those stories as well. What we don't want is to have this just represented as another version of what terrible people
and those
did
are
to
the
other
stories,
people.
Trevor, that need to be coming out.
Yeah, and you need to hear about the important role that you played, that Bernie Grant played, that Diane Abbott played in moving the story forward. And people who do great things. So if you look at a nation's history, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, they are symbols of what can be achieved.
Barack Obama?
Barack Obama is another, exactly.
I mean, the Education Secretary, Damien Hinds, has reported, I have to say, to have said that Labour should leave our kids alone and that the party is guilty of dangerous control freakery. Do you think that's fair?
And that's utter rubbish from Damien
Helen?
Hinds.
No
Unnecessary.
comment. I think we're going round in circles.
Yes, I mean, it may not
to be
have been
honest
to do
with
with
you.
this. It may not have been to do
I
with
don't
this
know.
particularly, but sort of generally. I mean, is there a danger of that? To be fair to Damien Hines.
No, I don't think so. I mean, unless somehow all our teachers have turned into the Stasi, I mean, that's not going to happen. And parents also have a role here in making sure that they understand what their children are learning. I think just politicising this and turning it into yet another thing to throw at, it's just... I mean, it's disreputable. It's disreputable.
Doing a disservice to the education system, and what we see is the purpose for education is both to open kids' minds and to teach them about the world, to get them interested in stuff. So doing it in a very negative way, I think, would be terrible.
That's it from all of us here. Andrew is on This Week Tonight with Tim Montgomery, Miranda Green, Michael Portillo, Kevin Maguire, Liz Kendall and Susie Quattro. I got through them all. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.